when I went to the archives at Hasbro, you know, people have talked about these secret archives and this warehouse building where they kind of house like one of everything. There was the wall where all the carded Real American Hero G.I. Joes were. There was a bat, and the bat was orange. So all the yellow on the straps that he had on him, this particular sample was like a dark orange, almost red. And I remember flipping that sample over, and it had a green tag on it, and it said, "What's up, everyone? Do you want to know how toys are made and all the steps in the toy production process? Well, keep watching, because I'm going to show you." What's up, gang? Thanks for tuning into another Valaverse video. Hope you guys are digging our content. This one is actually one that came from a lot of viewer feedback from our videos. We've been getting a lot of comments saying, hey, can you show us like the whole process of how your figures are made and all the steps and everything that goes into it. And I was like, I've talked about it a lot in podcasts and at shows, and I thought it might be good to really just do an in-depth video about the whole production process, because there's a bunch of steps and there's lingo that you guys have probably heard on videos being talked about, and you're just like, what does that mean? Some things I didn't know for a very long time, but now I do know now. Now that I'm into producing action figures. But I figured, let me grab some Series 5 stuff. It's our newest series out, so if you haven't got it, head over to valaverse.com. Cheap plug. Go get your Series 5 stuff. But I'm going to show you all the steps that go into making our action figures from concept to final production. So sit back, relax, grab some popcorn and a drink, and I'm going to show you all the steps. Okay, so the first step in this whole process is the concept phase. This is where I kind of come up with the character, figure out what I want to do, what the character is going to come with, what its deco is going to be, all the accessories. And I'm going to focus on the Action Force Series 5 Crimson Shadow Praetorian. This one was a very cool one. Seems like you guys like it because it's selling out like crazy. It's a fun one because it was our first kind of android. And this was a bit different for me because normally it's like I come up with all the characters and I draw them from scratch. I come up with all their gear. But this one, I knew I wanted to do, an android for Crimson Shadow, but I'm not a good robot designer. It's like I know where my strong suits are. They're not with robots. They're not with vehicles. So I had found a really good robot designer on Instagram, and he does 3D work. And I reached out to him and I said, hey, I have this idea. I want to work with you. Can I, get you to help me create the look of this android? Because I loved his work. And he said, well, hey, I have, some unused concepts that, I've never really shown, would you be interested in it? So he showed me, and I kind of grabbed a couple aspects from different ones, and we worked out a work for hire and, all that, and got him to do it and tweak some things on it. I added, the shields, the energy blade on the arm. I had another vendor do the weapons. So a lot of things came together from different people to make the Praetorian. So, I had a lot of input with it, even though it was kind of a semi-existing design. But designers did a great job with this. So I ended up taking it, and I took his 3D, and I said, all right, cool. Let's start the process. All right, what is he going to come with? So we know, all right, well, you got the figure. He's going to have the energy blade. He's got the 2 shields. He's got the spark effects. He's got all the weapons. So this is kind of like, you want your main page to show everything that the figure comes with. Of course, it's an Action Force figure, so it has a stand, multiple hands. But this is so that when I send this stuff over to China, my kickoff packet, they know exactly everything that comes with the figure. You want to know the size of your figure? Now, normally our figures are around the 6 1/4 range. A standard like Marvel Legends, Black Series Classified kind of size is that 6 1/4. But because these are androids, I want them to be a little more menacing, so I want them to be slightly taller. So I made them 6.6 inches. They're so they stand taller than the normal Action Force figures, which is cool because they look like a big formidable foe. So gotta have your sizes, makes everything easier for China. Because also, when we get to the 3D part, the discussion, you want to make sure that either your sculptor is doing the files to the appropriate size, or you make that clear to China when you're sending your kickoff packet over so they know the size of everything. Articulation is always important. You want to give a clear breakdown of, you know, all the points. You know, our figures are pretty standard. Like, they have the same articulation from figure to figure. However, for Series 5, we incorporated the double neck. So, you know, this one, him being an android and having, you know, a different build, the double neck was slightly a little awkward to do because it's not just your standard human neck. But this is what you do. You want to call out all the articulation so that everyone knows how the figure's going to work. So then you're going to get into things like, you know, if there's a certain play pattern or aspect to the design, like it had these, the force field shields that you could plug into different ports. So I wanted to show that, okay, you could plug it into the back, on the forearms, on the bicep, and then the sparks plug into the shield. So calling out stuff like that, you want to put as much information out there as possible. You can never have too much information. And then you get to deco sheets, you know, because they need to know when they're costing what's going to be mold color, what's going to be a deco operation, what's going to be inkjet, what's going to be tampo. And I'm going to get into, you know, all that lingo as we get into the deco phase of it. But, you know, you use your PMS books. You got to call all the PMS numbers so that the factory can match that and know exactly what colors they're doing. You do one for the accessories as well. So here you go, you know, same kind of basic colors, but, you know, there's some metallics on here with the bullet casings. And then here there are, I don't know if it's PMS that does it, but there are these chips, these translucent chips. There's books and binders of all these different chips that, you know, I have that you could see. And it's like when you want to spec a translucent or some sort of glitter metallic, or, you know, some sort of like an opaque, like a white pearl or something like that, you can go through and spec all these chips from that book. So that's what I did for this, because I wanted the translucent shields, the translucent sword, and the, you know, the spark effect. So those came in really handy for this one. So after you have the whole concept phase of it, now normally for a regular standard Action Force figure that I would draw and create, I'd send it over to a 3D sculptor. And that 3D sculptor would take my input drawings and they would create a 3D file of it. On this, Praetorian was a little different because the 3D file kind of already existed from the, you know, the individual that designed it. So we just took the files after, you know, when I got them in, because he's not a traditional toy sculptor. So, you know, there's all this weird like 3D lingo, like Booleaning and floating parts and this and that I don't fully understand. But I had to send those files over to one of my normal figure sculptors for them to, you know, carve out the articulation and make sure everything like worked well, so that when we sent it to the 3D printer and printed the parts, everything worked well. So once we got the file all done, I sent it to a 3D printer, and this is when they, you know, they 3D print the parts. So it's 3D printed in resin. So here's like, you know, the head and the torso for the Praetorian that was 3D printed. All sorts of different color 3D resins. This is, you know, this whatever material this gray is. There's orange, there's blue, there's white. You could do in clear. You could do all sorts of different stuff. But this is like, I don't know if it's PLA or what, but this is like the most detailed resin material you can get on 3D printed parts, because I want to make sure, like something like this, you don't want to lose any detail on your 3D printed parts. So then what they do is, after you 3D print it and you approve everything, make sure that the sizes are right, you want to make sure they mold and cast those parts. So they'll take that 3D printed part, they'll mold it in rubber, and then they'll cast it in a harder resin. And it's usually this blue stuff. These are done because then I have to make the paint master. And you can paint on 3D printed material, but 3D printed material is very brittle. So if you get your Dremel out and you're Dremeling out, you know, holes to put in your styrene rods for, you know, for your articulation, 3D prints will kind of crack and shatter. Whereas you use this poured resin is very durable. So this is what is used when I'm making my paint masters. Now, I was doing all my paint masters all the way up until just before Series 5. So all the figures before I did the paint masters for, which I love. I love the idea of doing it, but it's really time consuming to drill all these parts, clean them out, prime them, then paint them, because you have to do 2 samples. You do what's called a photo sample for you do for packaging and cross sales, and you do your paint master, which goes to China, and they use that for deco mapping. But because I've gotten so busy with Valaverse and Action Force, I now have the factory do the paint masters for me. Otherwise, I would be the one normally painting these parts. But I don't anymore. That's probably a good thing that I'm so busy. But it's also like, it's fun. I love doing it. But I kind of miss it. So, but the good thing is I have a really good factory that does my paint masters, and they do such a great job. So here is a paint master sample. This is a resin sample. You could tell it's might be hard to tell on video, but you know, this is a clear resin part that was 3D printed or poured, and then they spray this. You know, this figure, you know, he's wobbly because, you know, they're not exactly, you know, production, because they're resin poured. So, you know, he's missing, you know, the YS texture on his butterfly joints that we added in production later. But this is the first paint master that I will have gotten from the factory. You could also tell, like, you know, his rifle, the red is very glossy, whereas on the final production sample, it's more of a matte finish, just because when you're hand painting, it just will tend to have sort of a semi-gloss look to it, even if you're using mattes sometimes. It just has a different look between hand painting or airbrushing to factory applied paint. But this is the paint master that I got. You know, I usually get, you know, like 2 samples. Depends how the schedule is permitting, but I usually get 2 samples. And then I will have my photographer or several photographers. Sometimes it's also myself if I'm tight on, you know, a schedule. We'll use this to shoot for packaging photography. So 90% of the time when you see the back of one of our packages, this right here is this guy right here. So you'll see a paint master on the back, just because of time. The packaging files have to be finished way before production is finished on the figure. So, you know, you're always pretty much using a paint master for photography. I know a lot of companies use 3D renders. So basically they're taking the 3D file that, you know, these guys come off of, and they're rendering that file. It's very cool. It's interesting how, you know, toy production has come to that point. I'm not a big fan of it because it tends to make the figure always look a little fake. Like, you know, you're looking at something that's not real. And I always want to put the best foot forward as far as real. And this is, to me, this is closer to being real than, you know, the 3D render that you would do on your computer. So that is the paint master sample. And then after that, you know, once you send your kickoff sheet, your 3D files over to China, you know, they might have to clean up some of the 3D files here and there, change some things for tolerances and tooling. Undercuts are a big issue because when you're molding, you can't have undercuts because how's the mold going to pull? So they'll do what's called sort of a tooling sample. And that's this guy right here. So this guy is resin parts. So he's resin just kind of like this. They use a slightly different type of resin. Some pieces are hard, like his hands are soft because they're going to be soft PVC, but that's resin. All this is resin. But they send these over to let me know, like, are the sizes correct? Is the articulation, like, where they're going good? I mean, you'll never know for sure, but this is like, hey, we're going to cut steel. You can't go backwards. Are you okay with this? And I'll approve this. Now, some manufacturers don't always get a tooling sample. They'll get like pictures or video, you know, that their project manager at the factory will send them. I make sure I always get tooling samples because there's something about holding it in my hand and manipulating it and knowing that I'm feeling the physical product, like close to what the physical product will be, so that I can ensure that there's no issues with size or fit or function, that sort of thing. So that's the next stage, is your tooling sample. Now, once you've approved this, then it's like, okay, we're going to cut the steel. And then they use CNC machines to cut the big blocks of steel that will then become the molds for all of the final production figure parts. So after you tool it, and that takes a few weeks to tool the parts depending on complexity and how many parts you have. Series 5 had a ton of new tools because we had all new bodies and a big new tooling library and weapons and accessories. So it took quite a bit. But then we got it, and then when they'll usually test a couple samples. They're usually called test shots or VSPs. A VSP is a vendor sample pilot, and this right here is a test shot or VSP sample. So for those of you that collect prototypes, you guys will know what VSPs are. You've probably heard of VSPs or test shots. Test shots is a more common term for the first samples. Now these samples are usually undecoed. So here's Senshi and here's the Reaper driver for the Vanguard. You'll see they're just like solid mold colors. There's never any deco on VSPs or test shots. It's basically just mold testing. Sometimes you'll get parts that are ridiculous colors. For those of you that saw one of my old Vanguard videos, we have a powder puff blue Vanguard, and that's because they just happen to have whatever plastic they have on site. They'll use that to run the molds. They could have run that mold 3-4 times before I got parts. They'll tend to, tweak some things here and there before I get these. Now, there will always be tweaks and things you need to update after you get your test shot. I have never, in my over 15 years in the toy industry, I've never gotten a test shot that I was like, cool, good to go. No issues. A lot of times heads are sitting too high on the ball pegs, and you're like, well, how do you go from this to this? It's like, well, this is different. This is resin. Once you get into that steel and you have cooling times, parts push and pull and shrink. So there's always stuff you have to tweak and change. The fitting of a vest, is articulation joints too tight or too loose? A lot of things. Or is the detail too soft on a specific area? Sometimes you'll get to a point where it's like, okay, well, on our atlases, for instance, the tooling on the hip area, the detail really softened when it went to tooling. So we had to have the hips retooled to get that more crisp detail in it, because it's like you want to make sure that your figures feel really premium. For this one, the lower torso was sitting too high on the waist. So there's always going to be comments you make, but this is such a common area of production that a lot of people know about. Again, if you're a prototype collector, it's like, oh, I want a test shot. Like, test shots are like a coveted kind of thing because it's like the rookie card of the figure. It's like, this is the first time they're in physical form. Again, though, I got these samples. This could have been the 4th or 5th time they ran the mold. You don't know that. It just happened to be the first time I received it. So you never know. I've seen videos where they showed me a sample. Actually, I got a video of the Vanguard, and it was in like this cool OD green. And I was like, well, I'd never gotten that sample before. And I still to this day never received the OD green sample of the Vanguard, but just so happened they were running it in that color. I was like, oh, that's cool. I wish I would have gotten a sample in that color. I've gotten weird pinks and yellows and purples in VSPs, which is kind of funny. But if they do have your color on hand, like for him, they had the tan on hand. It also lets you see the mold breakdown. So what parts are ABS, what parts are PVC, what parts, like for instance, the lower torso and the hands and the boots and the head are in the same mold, they're PVC. Well, the arms and legs aren't, but they ran certain parts in certain colors because they figured out for costing wise what's the best parts to paint. So you're either gonna have to paint the lower torso or you're gonna have to paint the upper torso or vice versa. So they kind of figure that out based on the mold plan and what your colors are. So these are the first physical samples of VSPs or test shots. So moving on. Here's another cool, he's part of the Praetorian world. This was the Elite Praetorian. This is a VSP of that one, so you can see he's all translucent, which is cool. He's got no deco on him. You know, there's some parts that were going to be, you know, that dark metallic color. They ended up running him in black. But, you know, all of it, the stand, nothing has deco on it. So I always thought this sample was a very cool sample, just because there's something cool about translucent figures. So I kind of really dig that one a lot. So then after you get that, now depending on how many comments you're going to make on, you know, on these samples will depend on if you get a second round of VSPs. I normally don't see VSP, like a second round of VSPs. They kind of go right to EP sample. Now an EP sample can look like this, which could be pretty cool. So EP sample, time permitting, we'll try to give you as many updates as possible. Did they update the comments you made on the VSP? And then, hey, let's, an EP, which an EP is called Engineering Pilot. This sample will most of the time have all the deco on it. It's going to let you know, all right, this is what it looks like. Do we have to clean up some spray masks? Are some things, you know, a little wonky here? You'll see the tampo printing. Now, tampo printing, so for instance, the Crimson Shadow icon on the chest here, that's done with tampo printing. Tampo printing process is they have a stamp in a machine. It's usually like a rubber stamp. And the tooling machine will run paint on it, and then the stamp will come down and stamp the part. So that's like basically a rubber stamper. That's how it gets really, really crisp, clean detail. Now, the other thing that's starting to become more prevalent in toy production, which you see on a lot of the faces, especially all of our faces, but pretty sure every toy company is pretty much doing it now, is inkjet face printing. They used to do tampo printing on the faces. And it would be multiple operations. So if you had human eyes, the white on the eyes would be one stamp. Then the iris would be another stamp. And then the pupil would be a third stamp. So it was a long process of all these tampo hits. And each tampo hit is like a deco hit. So the eyes are one. So you're looking at 6 to 7 to 8 deco operations for eyes, depending on the complexity of it. That deco adds up. So I don't know who came up with the inkjet process first. I know some import figures like Figure Arts, they were doing it very early on. WWE was kind of one of the first mainstream companies that I remember doing it, because then we saw it when I was at Hasbro and we started implementing it with Marvel Legends, Star Wars Black Series, Classified. But you know, when Action Force came around, there was no question that we were going to do inkjet printing. So the inkjet printing is they put all the heads in a tray. And you can have anywhere from 10 to 50 to however many, depending on the size of the printer. And just like your printers at home that runs back and forth and lays the color down, it takes a file and prints all the levels of color on the faces. That's how you get a bunch of like shading depth. That's why the faces look a lot more real now. And, you know, look at an old figure from, you know, look at a Marvel Legends figure from, I don't know, 2014, 2015. You'll see that, you know, very, you know, almost looks like a comic book panel, like that tampo printing. But now you can get that level of shading and detail with the inkjet printing, which is really, really awesome. It's also improving, so you can get all sorts of crazy things. I just got a sample the other day of something that we're going to try that no other company has done before. And I saw it, and the execution of it was really cool. And I was like, all right, let's try to be the first ones to do that. But yeah, so that's, you know, some deco lingo for you. But yeah, so going back to the EP sample, you'll get the first deco sample. Again, sometimes they'll have made all the comments from VSP, or sometimes what they'll do is, all right, they're sending me the VSP, but when I'm getting this VSP in hand, they're already working on the EP. So some comments might not be done. So that's when you get like an EP2, or they'll fix it in FEP, which I'll get to next. But you go from VSP to EP, you know, you'll see it. Now, this is an EP that's on, you know, a blister card, which you normally don't see this. Usually EPs are just bagged samples, but it just so happened that this factory, this is a new factory I was using. They hadn't done our blister cards yet, so they just figured they would mock one up and, you know, see how everything would fit in the blister card. So again, you'll get some stages, you know, if EP is here, you might get some EP samples with this much, you'll get some EP samples with this much. It all just depends on how fast the factory's working or what stage they're at. But this is an EP sample. I always think these are the coolest because this is like really close to production. This is like you're seeing it with the deco for the first time, because the last time you saw it with deco was the Paint Master, and you can't really like play with these things. This is like you could really get into it with these figures. So I crack these open and I play with these, but you usually get a bunch of these samples. I usually get like 4 to 6 samples at EP stage. So again, there could be several rounds of EP stage. I never go past EP2. They normally iron everything out. And then after this, you'll get what's called an FEP. Now, an FEP is a final engineering pilot, whereas EP, engineering pilot, this is the final engineering pilot. Basically, it's pretty much a production figure. There might be minor things you're going to tweak. So this is an actual production figure, but this is exactly what my FEPs looked like, because they ironed out all the issues in the first EP stage and were able to get it perfect for FEP stage. Sometimes you'll see FEP, some things with the packaging might not be final. Again, sometimes maybe they'll miss a comment, depends on how many comments you're sending, or maybe they just missed something like, hey guys, you missed that comment that I made on EP. You gotta catch that up on FEP. But FEP is usually just, hey man, we're just about there. They're usually 90 to 100% final product. And if you need a second round of it, like if something, in very rare cases, if something was kind of messed up at FEP, I'm like, guys, I'm gonna need a second round of FEPs, because I'm not, or they'll send me some pictures or videos to say, hey, we'll send you a second round of them, but can you approve it over, video and pictures to make sure that, we can keep to the schedule. And that's what they'll do. Now at Hasbro, you got, EPs, FEPs. And then at Hasbro, you got what was called a green tag sample. Green tag samples were literally the first part of the production run. They were in production. So you really can't, if you make comments, they would be what's called a running change. Now, the green tag samples, it would be, one of these, and it would have a green tag taped to the back. And it would say what SKU it was and the project number. And myself, the marketer, the engineering, we would go to these green tag meetings and we would review the samples. You'd open some up, you'd mess around with them, you get to keep them as your samples. Say something was wrong, I'm like, oh, they never made that comment on the deco on his arm. We would have to write the comment on the actual green tag, and then those would get sent back to the factory so that there's a track record of how things were changed. I remember when I went to the archives at Hasbro, people have talked about these secret archives and this warehouse building where they kind of house like one of everything. There was the wall where all the carded Real American Hero G.I. Joes were. There was a bat, and the bat was orange. So all the yellow straps that he had on him, this particular sample was like a dark orange, almost red. And I remember flipping that sample over, and it had a green tag on it, and it said, change orange to yellow. And it was like, that was a green tag sample. I was like, I took some pictures of it, but that was a cool sample where you could see how the process changed, and then in production, they came out with yellow. So I just thought that was really cool. I don't get green tag samples. It's not part of like every company's process. It was mostly a Hasbro thing. I get, my FEPs. And then normally what they'll do is they'll send me some early production samples. Like, hey, if I'm doing a show or something, I want to have something on hand, they'll send me like a few, maybe a case of early production samples. Those are kind of like my green tag samples. But most of the time you don't ever have to, catch anything. And like I said, if you do catch something, it could be a running change. So if they get the final samples or the final comments, like if you were to get that green tag sample comment, they might say, okay, we could catch it, we could fix them. Or they'll say, hey, we're already 2,000 pieces into this production run, it'll be a running change. So people look at those as like maybe like errors or variants. It's like, to me in the industry, it's a running change. It's not, some people that's coveted, but it's like, oh, we just changed something in the running change process. There was an interesting story about a G.I. Joe item that someone used a running change to create a variant, and it caused some turmoil at Hasbro a little bit. But it was, for those of you that remember the Dollar General G.I. Joes, it was like Shipwreck, Duke, Cobra Commander, and I think Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes. And they did these Dollar General figures. They have very basic figures, like one accessory and a figure and a stand. And they did a certain deco. And the designer said, hey, what if I change the deco as a running change and then it becomes a variant? So they basically told the factory, hey, after 2 or 3, whatever X amount of pieces they said, change the deco to this. And the factory's like, okay, fine, we'll change it. They didn't change the spray mask, they just changed the colors. And then it became variants. Well, Hasbro didn't like that, retail didn't like it, because they're like, you know, when Amazon started getting into the mix, say you're buying this figure, you know, like I do my 1 of 100 variants. So you take the Bone Collector. Okay, well, Amazon's selling the Bone Collector. Well, if a customer just happens to have gotten the bloody version, they're like, this isn't what I bought, I didn't like this. And then Amazon's like, wait, why is this being returned? Like, you're giving us a variant. Like, no, we have to sell what we're selling. So that's how like variants kind of went away, is because of Amazon. Toy Biz used to do variants all the time. Well, once you start doing online sales, it's like what you're showing is what you're selling, and that's what the customer has to receive. So guys, blame Amazon for not doing variants anymore. When I was on Marvel Legends, I talked about it in one of my previous videos, is the Beast, the Marvel Universe Beast. I did the blue Beast, and I want to do the gray Beast. Well, we couldn't do a running change variant, so it wasn't a true variant. I had to use 2 item count spaces. So say you're given your item count, I had 6 items in that particular wave. Well, instead of just having the variant count as just 1 figure, it didn't count it as 2. I did the blue one was a SKU or an item, and the gray one was an item. Whereas back in the day, your variant counted as 1 item. Can't do variants anymore. But I don't have to deal with kind of like that sort of thing, like Bone Collector, like our exclusives. I could do the variants on, because I'm not selling on Amazon or on retail like that, where a customer would kind of, you know, complain and be like, this isn't what I ordered. But you know, so that's kind of a little history on variants and running changes. But I think that was everything. I think I touched on all the steps. Hopefully you guys enjoyed like this little in-depth process of how figures are made and all the stages. And this is why, like, you know, you're like, why does it take so long to make a figure? It's like, because there's so many, like, you know, the whole process, me doing the concept, and then a sculptor taking, you know, a few weeks to do that, and then all the other stages. And I said a couple weeks for tooling, you know, and testing all that and fine tuning everything. And then, you know, production alone, depending on how many pieces you're doing, if you're doing 10,000 pieces, you know, it's like that production can take a couple months, because they're constantly, you know, they're just doing it as quickly as possible, you know, but you can only run off so many parts in a day, and they have night crews and day crews. But, you know, that's it. So, you know, if you can do a redeco, you know, the production gets truncated and is a lot shorter, because you're not tooling new parts. When you're tooling new parts or starting something from scratch, that's where you start getting into that you know, that 12-month, 18-month window, depending on the company and the factory and the complexity of the item. But yeah, that's it. Again, hope you guys enjoyed this video. I love talking about this stuff. Hopefully it kind of gives you guys, like I said, you know, a peek behind the curtain. I love kind of giving that to you guys. You guys tend to like that kind of stuff. Make sure you guys are liking, subscribing, turning on notifications. We have new content coming out every Saturday morning at 9 a.m. We're doing some fun stuff. We got some great stuff planned on what we're doing for the channel. But yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought about this and maybe what you want to see in future videos.